My name is Ashley Cruz, and I'm a student program manager of El Centro. Today, we're going to do our third one of this series. So this is a series in which we feature alumni, staff, students, faculty in the Latinx community, and we just showcase their work, their research, and so forth. So today, we're going to be featuring Dr. Mauro Caraccioli. So thank you for joining us, Mauro.
It's a
And
pleasure. Thank you.
yeah, so we're going to try to keep it at 30 minutes, and yeah, ready to go. So my first question is, could you introduce yourself in the way that you would like to be introduced?
Sure. So thank you, Ashley, very much, and the folks at El Centro for this invitation. So my name is Mauro Caraccioli. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, and I'm also core faculty in a program called Aspect here at Virginia Tech. Aspect is an acronym for the Alliance for Social, Political, Ethical, and Cultural Thought. It's an interdisciplinary PhD program that we have here housed in the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences.
That is awesome. So what made you come to work at Blacksburg in the Virginia Tech area?
That's a great question, and it has sort of a bit of a winding answer because so I knew about Virginia Tech, and I had a desire to come work at Virginia Tech before it was ever really kind of a possibility, and I'll explain why in just a moment. So I did my PhD in political science at the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida. I was trained as a political theorist and as a scholar of international relations. And so I found myself very much torn between those two worlds, which even though for people who study political science, it's kind of like the same thing, right? Or just sort of different subfields. For me, it was a combination of a lot of different interests, including an interest in voices, experiences, and stories from Latin America that often didn't really fit neatly into the way political scientists talked about Latin America or talked about history or other things that fascinated me, for example. So when I was a graduate student, somewhere around the fall of 2013, one of my mentors from my time as an undergraduate, and just as an aside, I did my undergraduate work at Florida International University in Miami. That mentor, who had since come to Virginia Tech a couple years earlier, invited me to take part in what was then called the Future Faculty Development Program, which now is called the Future Faculty Diversity Program. So even though the name has changed, the principle was that this was a kind of a recruitment program sponsored by Virginia Tech, where, you know, they fly people in, they wine them and they dine them. And in the words of at least a few people who are involved with that program, it was an opportunity for candidates to come check out Virginia Tech, and also for Virginia Tech to check you out, so to speak, right? So I was still a graduate student, and I was nowhere near really competitive, I think, for a tenure track faculty position. But the program not only gave me an opportunity to learn a lot about Virginia Tech as an institution, but I had also the chance to meet several future colleagues in the Department of Political Science, because part of the program was also to set up mock interviews. So you would spend a couple days kind of talking with different administrators and members of the Virginia Tech community, and then you'd spend like half a day doing these short 30-minute interviews with other faculty colleagues in the department, right? And even though there was no job tied to it at the other end, the idea was that you treat it as a real job interview, and you know, you talk about your research and what you could contribute to a program like the one we have here. And so it was a huge, incredibly formative learning experience for me. So that a couple years later, in the fall of 2015, I had already defended my PhD, and I was in a visiting position somewhere else, and again I was approached by this same mentor to, hey, there's a job opening. Why don't you apply? It was the third time I applied to Virginia Tech, because I had applied to previous positions. Again, nowhere near, I think, competitive enough. But this time around, I sort of felt, well, you know, I have a job, so I've got some, you know, financial security. And I think that this job I'm being asked to apply for, I could be a really good fit, but I didn't really, you know, put too much, you know, stock into it at first. I thought like, well, what have I got to lose? So I applied. I got a shortlisted for the video interviews. I did well in those. I got invited for a campus visit to come back to Blacksburg and interview formally. And then I got the offer. And so for me, Virginia Tech was not like a new place. Even the community and the people in the department that I was coming to work in didn't really feel new. I felt like I knew a lot about how I would fit into the department, into the community. And over the years, this is now my fifth year here at Virginia Tech. I feel even more at home, if you will. I know that that's kind of like one of the de facto slogans of the Virginia Tech Blacksburg relationship. This is home, but it really did feel that way a lot sooner, I think, than many people who come out from outside of Blacksburg to this university.
Yeah, no, that is awesome. Well, we're glad to have you here. You know, when I first came here, I had a little bit of time adapting myself to the community, but as I met more friends and got to know each people, like it became like my new home. So yeah, pretty relatable. So there's a lot of like things were surrounding being Latinx. So would you define yourself as Latino, Hispanic, Latinx?
That's a great question. And so rather than giving you kind of the straight answer, right, I'll give you a little bit of context. So, you know, I've struggled with that question for many years. You know, I'm an immigrant. I came to the United States when I was 9 years old from Honduras in Central America. And I grew up in African-American neighborhoods and didn't really have much an experience with a Latin American diaspora until I was sort of closer to, you know, finishing high school, starting college. I spent more time with, say, immigrants and exiles from the Caribbean, right? So from Haiti, from the Dominican Republic, from Puerto Rico, from Cuba, of course. And so the term Latino and Latinx didn't make sense to me the same way that I think it would later when I learned more about what Latinos describe themselves as, folks who are from, say, the border, the U.S.-Mexican border, right? So colloquially, we would talk about, yeah, Latinos, you know, as this sort of catch-all phrase for all of us who were immigrants from Latin America. But for a long time, I just thought, well, I'm Hispanic, right? I come from this kind of group of people from Europe who settled, conquered, colonized the Americas. You know, I'm sort of white passing, right? So I don't have a lot of the connections that, say, a lot of other fellow, you know, comrades from the Caribbean or elsewhere do, in terms of very clear connections with indigenous communities or with Afro-Caribbean communities. And it's only until like the last few years that I've been involved with kind of a group of colleagues here. We are developing a minor in Latin American and right now it's called Latino and Latin American Studies, but the word and the name Latinx has kind of worked a lot there because it's clearly at the center of so much of the cultural and scholarly production of what does it mean to be from Latin America in the United States. But I'll confess that it's a language that is very new to me. And so while I have a younger sister, she's 10 years younger than I am, I think she maybe has a bit of a stronger sense identifying as Latinx. For me, it's a term that I feel awkward kind of embracing it because it wasn't my cultural experience, even if as a scholar, I do work and think about the vocabulary of that terminology and very much the politics of it, because I think it's a generational term as well. I think folks who are as old as I am struggle to think of themselves as Latinx, even though we recognize in, say, younger generations how important that term is as an identity marker, but also as a kind of a collective experience.
Yeah, for sure. I never heard Latinx until I came to college, and
Yeah.
I got more educated on the topic. It's very inclusive and welcoming to everyone. So yeah, it just takes time to get used to the new things that come our way.
Yeah.
So my next question is, what is your biggest challenge as a Latinx person in the New River Valley?
That's a great question. There aren't that many of us here. And it's, if you remain only within the borders of Virginia Tech, I think it's very easy to think of being Latinx in a one-dimensional sense. So, for example, my first experience outside of Blacksburg discovering the Latinx community was actually in the city of Roanoke, where in previous years, although because of the pandemic and other challenges, there hasn't been one in the last couple of years, there was a yearly Latino and Latin American festival in the city of Roanoke. And the activities sort of would culminate around the amphitheater kind of downtown Roanoke. And it was the first time in at least the 2 years that when we initially moved here, we saw so many Spanish speaking people in the same place, and the same kind of spectrum of different skin colors and kind of cultural icons that we were used to, my family and I were used to when we were in Miami, and that we hadn't seen anything like that since coming here. So I think when you ask the question, what's the hardest part about being Latinx in the New River Valley, is, well, it depends if you're involved at Virginia Tech or not. I think if you're involved at Virginia Tech, the hard part is realizing that there are other Latinx experiences outside of, the very specific one, say in El Centro or within our university community. I think if you're not affiliated with Virginia Tech, the hardest part is perhaps realizing that there are folks like us who think and talk about these things and who see the connections between Christiansburg, Radford, Roanoke, Blacksburg as being very much part of this geographical identity called the New River Valley that could lead to all kinds of great connections and exchanges, but is sometimes harder than what it looks.
Yeah, no, it's awesome though that our Hispanic community here is growing. As of the incoming freshman, I think it was 10% Latino, Latinx. Yep. So it's awesome to see that we're growing as a number. But my next question is, what do you miss being as a college student? I know you went to FIU and University of Florida. So want to talk about your experiences there as well, or?
Yeah, I mean, I joke about this with a lot of people. So what I miss, I think, the most from being a college student, both at FIU and UF, but especially at FIU, was being able to just get a cafecito right down the corner. Cuban coffee is a staple of the Miami, sidewalk culture. And anywhere you go, or on any strip mall, at any corner, you could just stop and get yourself a colada, a nice cafecito. No, but more seriously, I think the big difference that became evident to me when I left Miami and say moved to Gainesville, Florida, was the kind of dominance of a Latinx, Latin American, Hispanic connection. Clearly a city like Miami and any other kind of diaspora community, parts of Washington, D.C. feel this way. I'm sure parts of New York City feel this way with the diaspora from the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, for example. But being from Miami, Latin American politics was our daily prayer, right? It was like our daily bread and butter, right? We talked more about Latin American politics than we talked about U.S. politics. And some of that shows, I think, the inertia of so many people who come from Latin America, and even though they're in the United States, their eyes are still very much towards the South, versus a daily experience already, say, in Gainesville, where the Latino Latinx community, say in Miami, was very much painted with a broad stroke. And so it was very easy to talk about the Latino vote or the Latinx community. And coming from there, I realized, to be blunt, there's no such thing. I mean, there's different overlapping interests and communities. But I think oftentimes the term, Latinx really obscures all of that richness. And so what I miss a lot is not just the experience of the richness, but also the conversation, the fact that you could talk about the Argentine crisis one day, and then the Puerto Rican response to Hurricane Maria another day, and the Cuban government's latest, scandal another day still. Whereas a lot of that is lost, I think, when you leave that very tiny enclave of Miami. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, no, I went to Miami over spring break, and I was amazed by the Latino culture there. Everywhere you went, we'd speak Spanish, and my friends were amazed. They were not expecting that. So I was glad to be able to meet a lot of Latinx people while I was in Miami for a bit. Yeah. But no, that's awesome. So what do you like to eat in the New River Valley or Blacksburg area? Because I know there's not many places to eat that are
so this question has evolved, and I guess full disclosure, being in a pandemic, right, where travel is discouraged, I think has made me realize, reevaluate the good things that do exist in Blacksburg in terms of the local food scene. So upon moving here, of course, I was shocked, like there wasn't a kind of pan Latin American restaurant, right? Even one, or at least it felt that way. And over time, we discovered Latinos taste in the city of Radford. We discovered a couple of other spots in the city of Roanoke that gave us a taste of like, oh, like you could get arepas in one place in Roanoke, or you could get pupusas at another place. And then we began to discover some of the other more regional staples. So, this is obviously a plug for Supermercado Emily in Christiansburg, right? Which is your sort of pan Latin American grocery store. And they sell probably the best tacos and pupusas, not just in the region, but I think they're genuinely really, really good because they have kind of that home flavor. My family and I are big fans of gauchos, I'll have to confess. Again, not just it being sort of the only place that has a kind of Latino flavor, but it was also the environment. I think that, and we certainly miss that a lot now during these very difficult times. It really felt like walking into just a place where the music was loud, the conversation was loud, and everything felt homey, and nothing felt as if it was, excess. It was sort of the welcomed kind of carnivalesque quality of just what communal life feels like in amongst Latinx, Latin American communities, which is not to say that you can't find stuff like that around here. So one of our favorite spots in town, we have two that we are usually kind of are tried and true go-to places. One of them is Eastern Divide Brewery. They have a really great relationship with a catering company called Feast that has amazing food, and the environment is precisely that kind of homey environment that we really enjoy. And the other one is Zeppeli's. Again, same reason. It feels like home, right? You kind of go in there and people are sort of with family, with friends. It feels like an environment that you can just kind of not think about your worries for a couple of hours.
Yeah, no, I love Zeppeli's. This past weekend I went to Roanoke and I went to a Italian Venezuelan restaurant and it was amazing. So,
yeah, also that's one of our favorite. Leonor, I think it's Cafe Leonor. I think that's I can't remember the name right now.
Yeah, I can't remember the name, but yeah, no, it's an awesome restaurant. Then my next question is, what kind of music do you listen to?
So I have to also confess, they say that the music that was kind of that you listen to kind of in your most formative years, right, is the one that you're stuck to. And I think for a lot of people, their most formative years was probably like, their teenage years, right, like high school and that kind of stuff. I think I was a little bit of a late bloomer. I think my formative years were my college years, right? So, 18 to 22, 23. And so I discovered Latin rock bit later than others in my generation. So, in terms of my go-to guilty pleasure, I'm not apologetic about it, is, the music of Soda Stereo and particularly the work of Gustavo Cerati. It was formative in so many intellectual, cultural ways for me. Again, being in this context of Miami where I didn't have that, and I wouldn't have had that in Honduras, I think, just given the peculiar ways in which geography kind of works. And Latin rock became, I think, my first experiment with this idea that we have an identity as Latin Americans, or whatever we want to call them now, that revolves around a certain kind of musical expression. Over time, I've done the typical scholarly thing of thinking about the kind of intellectual nature of this music, and I always feel guilty because I feel like I'm going to ruin it for myself and ruin it for others. I still haven't, but it's not because I think I haven't ruined it, it's because I haven't treated it only as like a scientific object. But I think about Latin rock, every day. I listen to it every day. My much of my soundtrack, right, is either along the lines of the music of Soda Stereo and Anitos Verdes, Babasónicos, La Ley. I can think of so many others. And I would add, moreover, that I think about Latin rock a lot because I played music also as well when I was in college, and I knew many wonderful musicians who would play rock and roll in Spanish, and the whole notion to me was attractive because it wasn't what I associated rock and roll with, and yet here you had an entire lineage of cultural production that was for me incredibly influential, and I think worldwide has been incredibly influential. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I'm gonna have to look into those artists because I really need to look at new music. So during this pandemic, what kept you happy? What kept you occupied? I know it was discouraged to travel, of course, but
Yeah, I guess first and foremost, my family. And I don't mean it to sound in any kind of trite way, but I think we've been very lucky to one, be in a place where I think the lack of kind of density makes it so that, the sort of excess of transmission that we've seen in other places isn't as common. We've been in a place that it's incredibly beautiful all year round, even in winter. Even if it's too cold to kind of go outside for too long, it's an amazing place to see the mountains, see the leaves, enjoy the summers, right? It's sort of that perfect balance. It's neither the winters of Vermont, which I've lived through, nor is it the summers of Miami, which I've lived through. It was kind of the perfect combination of things. So, but my family and I think, have thrived during this time. Because normally I think I would be very much, at least half of my mind would be worried about, oh, I have to go to this conference, or I have to do this, or I have to go to this project, or I have to develop this thing. And I think the fact staying home for this period as a way of being safe has been a wonderful experience. I have 2 young kids, so I think that has also, really affected my own outlook towards that, and really made me grounded, kept me happy, if you will, or at least made me happy whenever kind of the doom scrolling of, watching all of our many crises unfold would kind of eventually get to be too much. I could always remember that, I've got these 2 kind of little kids, and a wonderful partner at home to work through all of these things together. I think other than that, I've really mostly thrived around the idea that slowing down a bit. I think for most of graduate school, and certainly the first few years of being here at Virginia Tech, have meant kind of a go, go, go sort of approach. And go, go, go usually translated into go out of here. And whereas I'm still very much go, 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 especially this semester, given a lot of the responsibilities I have as a graduate mentor, and also as a member of, say, communities like El Centro and other residential communities here on campus. But now the go, go, go has been directed more towards, okay, I want to bring stuff here. Mm-hmm. I want to bring speakers here. I want to bring resources here. I want to bring kind of experiences here, as opposed to me by myself kind of, taking ideas or experiences out to other places. I still like those things. And one day, if and when we ever kind of get back to that, I do enjoy going to new cities and meeting with friends and fellow colleagues. But I think the pandemic came at a time where it was probably really helpful for me to turn inward, and kind of both in a personal sense, but also inward in this community, and realize how much I can and maybe should be giving back to the community here.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
The next question is, I read that you got a Cesar Chavez Action and Commitment Award. Do you want to tell us more about it?
Yeah, well, I have to show you. It's a beautiful glass award. So this is a kind of a wonderful plug because this was an award from the Florida Education Association. And it was an award that I was nominated for in observance of my work for our employee union at the University of Florida. It was a union for graduate assistants. So these were graduate students who weren't just taking classes at University of Florida, but were also employees for the university. We would teach courses, we would serve as teaching assistants, we would do a lot of the behind the scenes work with our students. I mean, you can think of something, the equivalent of this would be, the residential colleges have RAs, and they typically have a graduate sort of RA as well, in addition to kind of undergraduate RAs, right? So, we did, the name of the union was Graduate Assistants United. It still exists. It's one of the oldest unions in the state of Florida, and it was really my job was kind of, I'd like to call it the utility man. I was kind of the person who was sent in to do the stuff that would be really difficult for the leadership to do. So I knocked on doors in departments across the university in recruiting new members. But I also took the resources of the union because, you know, we had a fairly sizable budget. And I took the resources to different departments across campus. I would host pizza parties. I would host coffee hours. I would host any opportunity to just listen to graduate students across the university and for them to tell us their concerns. I mean, whether they were members or not. Ideally, I would have wanted everybody I talked to sign up and become a member. And there were different reasons why people didn't do that. A lot of them economic, because you did have to kind of pay dues to become a member of the union. But the nice thing about the union, or one of the nice things about the union, was that we negotiated for all of the graduate students who were employed for the university. And so whatever we were able to negotiate in terms of our contracts, in terms of salary, benefits, healthcare coverage, et cetera, that applied to everybody, regardless of whether or not they were members. Mm-hmm. And so the award, I think it was really kind of a reflection of the fact that some people do their best work when they're at the head of an organization, right? When they're presidents, when they're vice presidents, when they are the spokesperson. And I think I felt, and in many ways I still do, that I do a lot of my best work when I'm not in the spotlight, if that makes sense. And again, I've been part of many student organizations over my time, and I'm a terrible delegator. So whenever I was in a really strong leadership position, I was by myself basically, and I kind of made it that way to my detriment. And so I realized over the years that, hey, maybe it's better if I don't take on an official role and instead kind of, work in the trenches and kind of help people get people what they need without it being sort of an official kind of objective, if that makes sense. So, the FEA has this kind of award ceremony every year, and that year I was able to get this award, but it was also sadly the year that I started my first job out of graduate school, and so I wasn't able to go. But they kind of took some quotes and questions, and my picture, I guess, was projected on a screen. But it's still one of my to this day, it's still one of my proudest, if not my proudest kind of recognition.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's very we're very happy for you for that. And one thing that I read about you is that you're working on a book manuscript titled "Of Nature and Other Demons: Missionary Science, New World Narratives, and the Future of Civilization." It's still in the works.
Yeah, actually, the book is done. I just haven't. I just haven't sent the update. I haven't sent the update to the folks at the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences to fix the website. But no, the book is done. It's actually coming out in January. The new title, because I had to. There were issues sort of with that title. The new title is Writing the New World, The Politics of Natural History in the Early Spanish Empire. And it's coming out with the University of Florida Press. It should be out January 10th, they tell me. I'm hoping there are no delays. Everything's done in my part. It's kind of been out of my hands since back in, I want to say, I submitted the final list of things probably like early September, and then I got the green light that, okay, it's going off into production at the end of October. So
that's awesome.
Yeah. And so the book is, to be completely honest, right, it's kind of the product of my doctoral research. So in the dissertation that I produced, it's very different than what the dissertation ultimately ends up being. I think one of the things you learn as a scholar is that, you may think you're going to do something one way when you start doing it, but the nature of scholarly life is that your work gets reviewed and assessed by peers, and ultimately your peers can include everybody from folk who are faculty like me, but also editors, right? So I had the really great pleasure of working with a brilliant editor by the name of Stephanie Hunter at the University of Florida Press, who really helped me think of the book, as a story that I wanted to tell. And the story that I wanted to tell is about this incredibly formative moment in the history of colonial Spanish America that I portray through the writings of Spanish missionaries. And the specific writings are these works of history called natural histories that on the surface seem like just accounting and cataloging of different flora, fauna and social practices that indigenous communities took part in around these animals and these plants. But they together, read together, and particularly through the ways in which some of them make it outside of the colonies to a bigger European audience and some of them don't, they tell the bigger story of not just the ways in which the Spanish Empire exercised domination and control over indigenous peoples. I think that should be first and foremost the kind of subtext of the story. But the other subtext is they tell the way in which colonial Latin America served as a jumping off point for the scientific revolution in Europe. And part of the argument, which is an argument targeted at political theorists, people like me who study kind of the history of ideas, but also targeted, I think, at a general readership that's interested in questions of climate change and how we exploit nature. It tells the story of how the drive for colonial domination was fed by the drive to dominate nature. And in order to do that, these missionaries had to tell a specific story about nature, stories that we are still telling today. And so in one of my follow-up projects, I look at how in the 20th and the 21st century, much of the ways in which both scholars and the general public talk about climate change, or they talk about natural disasters, so-called natural disasters, mirrors a lot of the ideas and comparisons that these same missionaries employed when they were trying to understand the New World. Whether it was about the influence of the devil in spaces that seemed, incapable of being dominated by human beings, or whether it was about the idea that nature had kind of its own autonomy, that it would extract revenge against human communities that tried to take too much from it. These are ideas that we still see very much today around natural disasters, whether they are hurricanes or whether they are volcanoes. But more importantly, there's stories that we still see being used to justify further exploitation of natural resources. And also the technical term is the dispossession, the kind of taking away of natural spaces from indigenous communities and just communities in general, I think. So the book very modestly tries to suggest that if we pay attention to kind of this period, it changes some of our understanding of where our ideas about science come from, sure, but it also changes our understanding of how important Latin America is, as problematic as it is, and as indeed as contentious as it is, as a space that you still see people of different races fighting against indigenous peoples over, who gets to have a say what Latin America is. That formative, that kind of debating and arguing takes place in this very formative moment in the 1500s, and that's what the book tries to convince people about.
Awesome. Hopefully we get to have it in our library in El Centro so we can check it out. And
yeah, absolutely. I'll have a copy definitely designated for El Centro. And the book actually benefited from a very generous grant from the we have an office for publication strategy here at Virginia Tech that provided me with a very generous grant to make it open access. So the book will actually freely be available to circulate as a PDF as well.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Hopefully everyone gets to read it because it sounds very interesting. My last question is, if you have time, I read that your principal research areas focus in political theory, international relations, Latin American studies, post-colonial theory, and critical ecology. Which one are you most passionate about and why?
That's a really unfair question because it depends if it's Monday, Tuesday, or Friday. So I have a degree in political science, but I have to confess I'm very undisciplined in that a lot of my work really is driven more by questions and ideas that I have. I like to tell stories. And some days I tell those stories as a political theorist. Some days I tell those stories as a Latinx, Latin American studies person. And other days I tell those stories as somebody who's interested in nature and ecology. I think that in the academy we spend a lot of time for good, but also for bad reasons, thinking of labels that define us. And I think I've always struggled with that. And part of that comes from something I didn't mention was that as an undergraduate, I was a dual major. I was a philosophy and international relations major. And, I studied philosophy because it was what really interested me. And I studied international relations major because a lot of folks around me with good intentions were telling me, oh, you needed to get a job in something. So I thought I'm going to study international relations. the prospects of getting a job out of undergraduate only with international relations degree are much more complicated than I think I knew at the time. But nevertheless, right? Oh, I listened. And something that I learned over many years of study and research is that, these are labels that are developed to help people like me become recognizable in the eyes of others. And yeah, within the academy as well, we spent a lot of time kind of policing those labels. But my interests from the very beginning were always to kind of pursue the ideas that I thought mattered to me, and that in some way or another made me feel that I was leading a richer life. And over time, that has pushed me into thinking more explicitly about, say, Latin America, or thinking about Latin American issues as I kind of think about my own history as an immigrant, but also as somebody that is more from the United States than from Latin America at this point, right?
Yeah.
And I always kind of laugh a little bit when I have to think about these labels, because I wish I could just say, like, I'm a storyteller, I focus on these things, and I think they're important stories that help us understand why society is the way it is today. And that may be interesting to a lot of people, not just people who study political theory or people who study, post-colonial theory. But that's my personal kind of gripe. But that's, I think, the answer that I would say. It depends what day it is, what hat I want to wear.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Mauro Caraccioli, for taking the time to be part of this series. And thank you again for sharing everything. It's been quite a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so very much.
Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.